Germany is a geopolitical paradox that Europe has never truly solved. When Germany is at peace, Europe trembles at its economic power. When Germany is at war, Europe fears its military ferocity. And when Germany is defeated, Europe grows anxious over the vacuum its collapse leaves behind. For more than a century, European history has revolved around a single unresolved dilemma. How do you restrain Germany without destroying the balance of Europe itself? No country understood this fear more viscerally than France in the aftermath of the First World War. France did not see Germany merely as a defeated enemy. What it saw was something far more disturbing, a permanently dangerous neighbor, a nation with a vast population, deep industrial capacity, and a geographic position that placed it directly on France's doorstep. Within the span of 50 years, German armies had marched into Paris twice for the French leadership in 1919. This was not an abstract historical lesson, it was lived experience. The fields of northern France were still scarred by shell craters. Entire towns had been erased from the map. An entire generation of French youth had been consumed at Verdun and the Somme. So, when the war ended, France was not asking how to reconcile with Germany. France was asking how to survive Germany. To Paris, this was no longer a question of diplomacy or moral principle. It was a question of national existence. And yet, history has a cruel sense of irony. Barely 20 years after Germany was forced to kneel and sign what many would later call the most humiliating treaty in modern history, German tanks once again rolled down the Champs-Élysées. The French army collapsed in weeks. The French Republic fell so quickly that even its own leaders struggled to explain how it had happened. This raises a far more unsettling question than any battlefield defeat. How does a nation stripped of its land, shackled economically, and humiliated morally manage to rise again, not once, but twice, and drag the entire world into catastrophe? To answer that question, we must return to the moment when the modern world was broken and then glued back together incorrectly. June 28, 1919, the day peace was signed, and the day the foundations for the next war were quietly laid. Paris, 1919. The guns had finally fallen silent. The trenches were empty. The armies were exhausted. But if anyone believed that the war had truly ended, they were mistaken. A new conflict was beginning, not one fought with artillery and infantry, but with ink, signatures, and numbers written on paper. The victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris to decide the fate of the defeated German Empire. The setting was ornate, almost theatrical: grand halls, chandeliers, polished tables, and statesmen in tailored suits. Yet beneath this polished surface, the atmosphere was thick with resentment, fear, and unresolved rage. This was not a negotiation between equals. Germany was not invited as a part. In peace, Germany was summoned as a defendant. The German state arrived in Paris exhausted, starving, diplomatically isolated, and politically fragile. Its navy had mutinied. Its Kaiser had fled. Revolution simmered in its streets. There were no allies left to speak on its behalf, no leverage to exert, and no realistic military option remaining. The message from the Allies was unmistakable: sign the treaty, or we resume the war. If Germany refused, Allied forces were prepared to advance deeper into German territory, occupy the country by force, and carve it apart at will. The German delegation understood the reality immediately. This was not peace offered freely. This was peace imposed under threat. What Germany was being asked to sign was not merely a ceasefire agreement. It was a blueprint for the systematic dismantling of a nation. The treaty was constructed with a clear hierarchy in mind. The victors would dictate terms. The defeated would accept them without amendment, without negotiation, and without dignity. German representatives were not allowed to participate in drafting the treaty. They were shown the final document and given a deadline. Their objections were recorded, ignored, and discarded. When the Germans protested that the terms violated President Wilson's earlier promises of a just peace, they were reminded that promises made in war were not obligations in victory. In Germany, the reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Many Germans had believed, naively, as it turned out, that the armistice of 1918 had been based on mutual principles. They had heard Wilson's 14 points. They had expected a peace built on reconciliation, self-determination, and fairness. What they received instead felt like a sentence handed down by a court that had already decided the verdict. The treaty did not merely aim to end the war. It aimed to reshape Germany's future, and at its core was a single, unspoken assumption shared by many in Paris, that Germany, if left capable of recovery, would inevitably threaten Europe again, for France especially. This belief bordered on obsession. French leaders did not see the treaty as punishment. They saw it as prevention. From their perspective, history had already taught its lesson. Germany had unified, industrialized, and militarized with terrifying speed once before. Allowing it to do so again was, in French eyes, an invitation to national suicide. Peace, therefore, had to be enforced, not trusted, and enforcement, as the Allies would soon demonstrate, meant stripping Germany of the foundations of power itself. The architects of the Treaty of Versailles understood a fundamental truth of geopolitics. Military power does not exist in isolation. Armies are not born overnight. They are built over decades, through training systems, command structures, industrial capacity, and institutional memory. If the Allies wanted to ensure that Germany would never again threaten Europe, they believed they had to destroy these foundations permanently, so they did not merely reduce the German military. They designed it to wither. The German army, once the most feared fighting force on the European continent, was capped at a mere 100,000 men, not 100,000 per region, not a temporary reduction, 100,000 in total, a force barely sufficient to police internal unrest, let alone defend national borders. Just as significant as the numbers was what the treaty eliminated entirely: the German General Staff, the intellectual engine of Prussian military dominance, was abolished. This was no symbolic gesture. For decades, the General Staff had functioned as a military brain trust, producing doctrines, war plans, and professional officers trained to think strategically. Its dissolution was meant to sever Germany's ability to plan complex military operations in the future. The Navy suffered a similar fate. Germany's fleet, which had once challenged British supremacy at sea, was reduced to a coastal defense force in name only. Battleships were seized or scrapped. Submarines, the weapon that had nearly strangled Britain during the war, were banned outright. Naval personnel were capped at 15,000 sailors, ensuring that Germany could neither rebuild its fleet nor train a new generation of naval officers. The sky was closed entirely. Germany was forbidden from possessing an air force of any kind. No combat aircraft, no military aviation training, no infrastructure that could even hint at future aerial capability. In an age when air power was rapidly becoming decisive, Germany was being locked out of the future of warfare. Tanks, heavy artillery, and modern weapons followed the same pattern: prohibited, destroy, monitored. But perhaps the most insidious provisions were not about equipment, they were about time. Officers were required to serve for 25 years, enlisted soldiers for 12. This system ensured that Germany did not rotate personnel or create a large reserve force. The army would grow old, rigid, and incapable of rapid expansion. No young officers, no trained masses, no surge capacity. This was not disarmament, it was structural paralysis. Yet even as the Allies stripped Germany of its military capacity, they understood that armies are ultimately reflections of economic strength. Guns and ships cannot exist without steel, coal, factories, and money. And so, once Germany's sword had been broken, The Allies turned their attention to something even more dangerous: Germany's land and Germany's economy. Military defeat alone was never enough. The Allied powers understood that true power is rooted in geography and resources. Armies could be restricted on paper, but industrial capacity, population size, and access to raw materials determined whether a nation could recover in the long run. If Germany was to be permanently contained, its economic foundations had to be weakened, not temporarily, but structurally. The territorial losses imposed on Germany were therefore not random. They were surgical. In total, Germany was stripped of approximately 13% of its European territory and nearly 1/10 of its population, but these numbers alone obscure the real damage. What Germany lost were not peripheral lands. They lost some of its most productive regions. Alsace-Lorraine, the symbolic prize of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, was returned to France. This was more than a matter of national pride. The region contained vital iron ore deposits that fed German steel production. By reclaiming it, France was not just correcting a historical grievance, it was reclaiming industrial leverage. To the west, the Saar Basin, one of Germany's richest coal-producing regions, was placed under international administration. Its coal mines were handed to France for 15 years as compensation for the destruction of French industry during the war. Coal was the lifeblood of early 20th century economies. Without it, factories stopped, trains halted, and steel production collapsed. In the east, Upper Silesia, an industrial powerhouse of coal mines, steelworks, and factories, was carved up through plebiscites and international decisions. The richest mineral deposits were transferred to the newly re-established Polish state, further fragmenting Germany's industrial heartland. Germany's overseas empire met an even harsher fate. Its colonies in Africa and the Pacific were confiscated outright and redistributed among the victors: Britain, France, Belgium, and Japan, as League of Nations mandates. Officially, this was framed as stewardship. In reality, it was the total elimination of Germany's global economic footprint. Markets were lost, resources vanished, strategic reach was erased. What remained was a nation increasingly confined within its borders that now enclose fewer people, fewer resources, and fewer opportunities for growth. But land and industry were only part of the equation. The Allies were not satisfied with weakening Germany's ability to produce wealth. They wanted Germany to transfer wealth. They wanted payment. To justify that demand, however, they first needed something far more powerful than economic logic. They needed moral guilt. Before the Allies could demand money, land, and obedience, they needed something more fundamental. They needed Germany to accept guilt, not shared responsibility, not collective failure, but exclusive moral and legal blame for the war itself. This demand was formalized in what would become the most infamous sentence of the Treaty of Versailles, Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. On paper, Article 231 appeared to be a legal technicality. It stated that Germany accepted responsibility for all loss and damage suffered by the Allied powers as a consequence of the war. In practice, it served a far greater purpose. It transformed a complex, multi-sided geopolitical conflict into a moral indictment of an entire nation. By signing the treaty, Germany was not merely acknowledging defeat, it was admitting criminal liability. Every ruined village in France, every fallen soldier, every shattered economy was now legally Germany's fault, and therefore Germany's debt. For the Allied governments, this clause was essential. Without it, there could be no legal basis for unlimited reparations. With it, any financial demand could be framed not as punishment, but as justice for the German people. The effect was devastating. This was not perceived as an abstract legal obligation imposed on a defeated state. It was experienced as a collective accusation. Teachers, factory workers, farmers, veterans, people who had never made a single strategic decision, were now branded as accomplices in a global crime. the reaction in Germany was explosive. Church bells rang in mourning rather than celebration. Newspapers printed black-bordered editions. As if announcing a national death, demonstrations erupted in Berlin and across the country. The treaty was denounced as a diktat, an imposed verdict, not a negotiated peace. Even politicians who supported the new democratic Weimar Republic struggled to defend it. Many warned that signing the treaty would poison German politics for a generation. Others argued that refusal would mean immediate invasion and national dismemberment. In the end, Germany signed, but the psychological damage was irreversible. Article 231 did something subtle and dangerous. It severed the link between responsibility and agency. Germans were told they were guilty, but given no meaningful role in shaping the outcome. The result was not remorse, it was resentment, and resentment, when embedded into national identity, becomes a powerful political force. Yet even as Germany seethed, the greatest conflict surrounding reparations was not between the victors and the vanquished, it was between the victors themselves. Behind closed doors in Paris, the Allied powers were fighting their own war, a war over numbers, priorities, and the future of Europe. To the outside world, the Treaty of Versailles appeared as a unified judgment delivered by victorious powers. In reality, it was the product of intense disagreement, conflicting interests, and barely concealed hostility among the Allies themselves. The true battle in Paris was not Germany versus the victors, it was France versus Britain versus the United States. Each arrived at the negotiating table carrying its own scars, ambitions, and economic calculations, and each envisioned a very different post-war world. France was the most uncompromising. No country had suffered more visibly on the Western Front. Entire regions of northern France had been reduced to rubble, industrial centers were destroyed, millions were dead or wounded. For French leaders, reparations were not abstract figures on a balance sheet, they were compensation for blood and devastation, but there was something deeper than money driving French policy. France had lived in the shadow of Germany since 1871, twice humiliated, twice invaded. French leaders believed that Germany, if allowed to recover, would inevitably return as an existential threat. Reparations, therefore, were not just about payment, they were about containment. France wanted Germany weakened, dependent, and permanently constrained. Some in Paris spoke openly of breaking Germany apart or turning it into an agrarian state. Incapable of modern warfare, harsh reparations were seen as a substitute for permanent military occupation. Across the table sat the United States, carrying a radically different worldview. America had entered the war late and emerged economically dominant. Its cities were intact, its industries booming. Its banks had become the creditors of the world. President Woodrow Wilson spoke the language of idealism, self-determination, collective security, and a peace without vengeance. But beneath this rhetoric lay a hard financial reality. American banks had lent billions of dollars to Britain and France to finance the war. If Europe collapsed economically, those loans would never be repaid. The United States needed stability, not ruin. A Germany crushed beyond recovery would mean a Europe permanently unable to trade, grow, or service its debts. Wilson's vision required a Germany that was restrained, but solvent, punished, but functional. Britain found itself caught in the middle economically. British policymakers largely agreed with the Americans. Before the war, Germany had been Britain's second-largest trading partner. A destitute Germany that lost markets, higher unemployment, and a weaker British economy. Strategically, Britain also feared French dominance. A permanently weakened Germany would leave France as the uncontested land power in Europe, an outcome London found just as unsettling as German strength, but British politics made compromise nearly impossible. The British public, fresh from a brutal war, demanded vengeance. Newspapers called for the Kaiser to be hanged and Germany to be squeezed until the pips squeak. Prime Minister David Lloyd George faced an electorate that equated leniency with betrayal. Publicly, he demanded harsh terms, Privately, he tried to restrain them. The result was paralysis. Unable to agree on a final reparation figure, the Allies postponed the decision, creating a reparation commission to determine the amount later. This compromise satisfied no one. Germany was humiliated but not destroyed. France was appeased but not secure. Britain and America got neither stability nor clarity. The treaty that emerged was too harsh to be accepted, yet too vague to be enforced cleanly. And while politicians debated borders and battleships, one man watching from the margins understood the danger immediately. His name was John Maynard Keynes. All politicians argued over borders, fleets, and blame. A young British economist sat quietly within the Treasury delegation, watching the negotiations with growing alarm. His name was John Maynard Keynes. At the time, Keynes was not yet the towering intellectual figure he would later become. He was a brilliant but relatively unknown civil servant, tasked with advising the British government on the economic implications of the peace settlement. What he saw in Paris convinced him that the Allies were making a catastrophic mistake. Keynes approached the problem not through ideology or vengeance, but through arithmetic. He examined Germany's productive capacity, its industrial output, its export potential, and its shattered infrastructure. He calculated what Germany could realistically transfer abroad without collapsing its own economy. His conclusion was blunt. Germany could not pay what the Allies were demanding. Keynes estimated that Germany's maximum capacity to pay reparations was around £2 billion, roughly $10 billion at the time, and even that figure assumed severe sacrifices by the German population. The sums being discussed in Paris were 2, 3, even 5 times higher. The problem, Keynes argued, was not merely moral. It was mechanical. To pay reparations, Germany would need to export far more than it imported. That meant producing massive trade surpluses year after year. But the Allies were simultaneously seizing Germany's merchant fleet, confiscating overseas assets, and restricting access to their own markets. In other words, Germany was being told to pay, while being denied the means to earn. Keynes warned that wealth could not simply be extracted from a modern industrial society without consequences. Money paid abroad had to come from somewhere. Wages, savings, investment, or consumption drained those sources too aggressively, and the economic system itself would collapse. Disgusted by what he described as a Carthaginian peace, a reference to Rome's total destruction of its rival Carthage, Keynes resigned from his post. He retreated to the English countryside and wrote a book that would become one of the most influential political economic works of the 20th century, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In it, Keynes laid out a grim prophecy. He argued that enforcing excessive reparations would not only bankrupt Germany, but destabilize all of Europe. European economies, he explained, were deeply interconnected. If Germany collapsed, it would drag down Austria, Hungary, and much of Central and Eastern Europe, eventually undermining France and Britain themselves. Most ominously, Keynes warned that economic humiliation would not produce compliance, it would produce rage. Vengeance, he wrote, does not walk slowly, it accelerates. His book became an instant global sensation, selling over 100,000 copies in just 6 months. In the United States, it profoundly influenced public opinion. The American Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, and the U.S. retreated into isolation, abandoning European stabilization efforts. But in Europe, Keynes's warnings were largely ignored. The Allied powers were now bound together by a far more dangerous force than ideology. They were bound by debt. By the early 1920s, Europe was no longer governed by diplomacy or ideals. It was governed by debt. The war had not ended financial obligations. It had rearranged them into a deadly triangle that locked entire nations together like prisoners. In a chain gang, at the top of the system stood the United States. During the war, American banks and the U.S. government had lent enormous sums to Britain and France to finance their war effort. By 1919, those loans totaled more than $10 billion, an astronomical figure at the time, America, now the world's dominant creditor, expected to be repaid in full. There would be no forgiveness, no restructuring, no moral arguments. Accepted, Britain and France faced a brutal reality. Their economies were shattered, their industries damaged, their currencies weakened. They simply did not have the resources to repay the United States out of their own domestic production, so they passed the pressure down the line. Britain and France told Washington, "We can only pay you if Germany pays us," and so Germany became the foundation stone of the entire post-war financial order. America demanded repayment from the Allies. The Allies demanded reparations from Germany. Germany, stripped of territory and economic capacity, was expected to somehow produce the wealth to satisfy everyone above it. The system had no safety valve. If Germany failed, Britain and France would default. If Britain and France defaulted, American banks would suffer catastrophic losses. Every nation was trapped, enforcing a system it privately understood was unsustainable. In 1921, the final bill arrived. The London schedule of payments set Germany's total reparation liability at 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it defied comprehension. In modern terms, it would amount to hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet even this number concealed a deception. The Allies divided the total into three classes of bonds, A, B, and C. The A and B bonds, totaling around 50 billion marks, represented the amount Germany was realistically expected to pay. The C bonds, more than 80 billion marks, were largely fictional. They existed for political theater. French and British leaders needed a massive headline number to satisfy angry voters at home. The public wanted Germany punished visibly and permanently. Quietly admitting that Germany could never pay the full sum would have been politically suicidal. So the illusion was maintained. But even the realistic portion of the debt was crushing. Germany faced a simple problem. Reparations had to be paid in foreign currency, or gold, not paper marks. To obtain those currencies, Germany needed to export massively. But its industries were damaged, its merchant fleet seized, its access to foreign markets restricted, with few alternatives left. The German government turned to the only tool still available to it, the printing press. At first, the collapse was subtle. The German government did not immediately face mass starvation or visible social breakdown. Instead, the warning signs appeared quietly in the currency markets. To meet its reparation obligations, Germany needed foreign currency, dollars, pounds, francs. Lacking sufficient exports, the state began purchasing foreign currency using newly printed paper marks. The result was predictable. The value of the German mark began to slide. In early 1921, $1 could be purchased for roughly 60 marks. By the end of that same year, the exchange rate had fallen to 300 marks per dollar. To policymakers, this appeared manageable, even useful. A weaker currency made German exports cheaper abroad. Factories could sell goods more easily, and employment was temporarily supported. Inflation, in this early phase, was not seen as a disaster. It was a policy choice. But inflation is not a tool that can be precisely controlled. As the mark weakened, prices rose. As prices rose, wages followed, but never fast enough. Savings accumulated over decades began to lose value. The German middle class, which had been the backbone of social stability, watched its financial security erode month by month. Still, the government hesitated to change course. Raising taxes to cover reparation payments risked political unrest and revolution. Cutting spending would worsen unemployment. Inflation, by contrast, spread pain quietly and unevenly. It was the path of least resistance. By 1922, the situation had become critical. Germany formally requested a moratorium, a temporary pause in reparation payments. Britain was willing to negotiate. London understood that pushing Germany too far risked total collapse. France refused. French leaders, particularly Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, believed Germany was bluffing. In their view, Germany was deliberately undermining its own currency to evade payment and humiliate France. They were convinced that only force would compel compliance. In January 1923, when Germany defaulted on deliveries of coal and timber, France acted. French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany. The Ruhr produced roughly 80% of Germany's coal, iron, and steel. By occupying it, France aimed to extract reparations directly from the source. Germany did not resist militarily. Its army had been reduced to a symbolic force by the Treaty of Versailles. Instead, the German government adopted a strategy of passive resistance. Workers were ordered not to cooperate, mines shut down, factories stopped, railways fell silent. The industrial engine of Germany ground to a halt under occupation. France found itself controlling a region that produced nothing. But passive resistance came at a devastating cost. Millions of workers still needed wages. Families still needed food. Yet the German state was receiving no tax revenue from its most productive region. With no income and no political will to raise taxes, the government returned to the printing presses. This time, without restraint. What followed was not ordinary inflation, it was hyperinflation. By mid-1923, the German economy was no longer functioning in any recognizable sense. The Reichsbank's printing presses ran day and night, producing banknotes in denominations that would have been unthinkable only months earlier. Currency was no longer a store of value, it was a rapidly decaying commodity. Useful only if spent immediately, the collapse can be measured in numbers. But its true impact was felt in daily life. Before the war, in 1913, a single egg cost 0.08 marks. By November 1923, that same egg cost 80 billion marks. A loaf of bread required a wheelbarrow of cash. A pair of shoes cost trillions of marks. Workers were paid twice a day so they could rush to spend their wages before prices doubled again. Savings accumulated over lifetimes vanished in weeks. Insurance policies, pensions, and bonds became meaningless scraps of paper, but the damage went far beyond economics. Hyperinflation obliterated the moral foundation of society. The people who suffered most were not speculators or gamblers. They were teachers, civil servants, doctors, and small business owners, the very class that believed in order, rules, and gradual progress. They had trusted the system, saved diligently, and followed the law. The system destroyed them anyway. Farmers refused to sell food to city dwellers in exchange for worthless paper. Barter replaced money. City residents raided the countryside. Gangs formed. Trust between neighbors collapsed. This was not simply a financial crisis, it was a psychological trauma. Faith in democracy eroded. Faith in capitalism evaporated. Faith in the rule of law dissolved. The Weimar Republic, born only a few years earlier, now appeared weak, incompetent, and illegitimate. In this atmosphere of humiliation and desperation, radical voices found fertile ground. In Munich, a furious agitator named Adolf Hitler began to attract attention. He railed against the November criminals who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, against foreign occupiers, and against internal enemies he blamed for Germany's ruin. In November 1923, at the height of the hyperinflation, he attempted to seize power in the beer hall putsch. The coup failed. Hitler was in prison, but the damage had been done. The idea that democracy had betrayed Germany, and that only force could restore dignity, had taken root. Ironically, the crisis was harming France as well. The occupation of the Ruhr was costing more than it produced. The French franc weakened. British and American leaders accused France of destabilizing the global economy. The entire system was collapsing under its own weight. Everyone was losing. Germany was dying, and if Germany collapsed completely, reparations would vanish. War debts would go unpaid, and the post-war financial order would implode. Something had to change, and once again, the solution would not come from Europe. It would come from the United States. By late 1923, it was clear that Europe had driven itself into a dead end. Germany was economically shattered. France was bleeding money in the Ruhr. Britain was watching continental trade collapse. And the United States, though officially isolated, was facing an uncomfortable reality. If Germany could not pay reparations, then Britain and France could not repay their war debts to Washington. The entire post-war financial system was interconnected, and it was failing. American bankers understood this long before politicians did. In 1924, under U.S. pressure, an international committee led by American financier Charles G. Dawes was formed to redesign the reparations system. The result was the Dawes Plan, not a solution to reparations, but a way to make them temporarily workable. The core idea was deceptively simple. Germany would not be forced to pay an impossible fixed sum. Instead, payments would be scaled to economic capacity. Reparations would start low and increase gradually as the German economy recovered. But the real engine of the plan was capital. American banks would lend massive sums of money to Germany. These loans would stabilize the currency, rebuild industry, and restart production. Germany would then use that money to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France, in turn, would use those payments to service their war debts to the United States. Money would flow in a circle. Dollars left New York, passed through Berlin, Paris, and London, and returned to New York with interest. It was an elegant financial machine. In 1924, the German mark was replaced with a new currency, the Renmark, backed not by gold but by land and industrial assets. Confidence returned almost overnight. Prices stabilized. Hyperinflation ended. Foreign troops withdrew from the Ruhr. Factories reopened. Employment surged. German cities came back to life. Cafes filled. Construction cranes dotted the skyline. For the first time since 1914, Germany felt normal again. This period would later be remembered as the golden years of Weimar, but the stability was fragile. Germany's recovery was not built on internal savings or balanced budgets. It was built on foreign credit, overwhelmingly from the United States. By the late 1920s, Germany had become one of the most indebted nations on earth. As long as American money kept flowing, the system worked. If it stopped, everything would collapse again. Very few people wanted to ask what would happen if Wall Street sneezed, because if it did, Germany would catch pneumonia, and Europe would relapse into crisis, and a bill for postponing reality had not disappeared. It had only been deferred. Between 1924 and 1929, Germany appeared transformed. Industrial output surged back to pre-war levels. New housing projects rose across Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt. Modern factories embraced electrification, chemical engineering, and mass production. German firms once again competed on global markets. Culturally, the country flourished. Berlin became one of the most vibrant cities in the world, a center of cinema, architecture, philosophy, and experimental art. To outside observers, the Weimar Republic looked not just stable, but modern. Politically, tensions seemed contained. Coalition governments rose and fell. But democracy endured. Extremist parties lost ground in elections. The trauma of hyperinflation felt like a nightmare that had passed, but beneath the surface, the foundations were dangerously weak. The German economy was not healing itself. It was being propped up. By 1928, foreign loans accounted for a substantial share of German investment. Short-term American capital financed everything from industrial expansion to municipal budgets. Banks borrowed abroad and lent at home, assuming the flow of credit would never stop. It was a gamble. German exports struggled to remain competitive. Agricultural prices collapsed, crushing rural communities. Unemployment never truly disappeared, especially among industrial workers vulnerable to cyclical downturns. At the same time, reparations had not vanished, they had merely been restructured. The Dawes Plan did not cancel Germany's obligations, it postponed and smoothed them. In 1929, it was replaced by the Young Plan. which reduced the total amount owed but extended payments far into the future, until 1988. To many Germans, this felt like a life sentence. Nationalists denounced the plan as permanent servitude. They argued that Germany would never be truly sovereign while reparations remained. These arguments resonated deeply with those who remembered the humiliation of the early 1920s. Then, in October 1929, the world changed. The Wall Street crash shattered confidence in American financial markets. Banks called in loans. Investors scrambled for liquidity. Capital fled Europe almost overnight. For Germany, the impact was immediate and devastating. American credit vanished. Factories that depended on short-term financing collapsed. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment surged from 1.4 million in 1928 to over 6 million by 1932. Once again, democracy was blamed. The Weimar government, constrained by international obligations and political fragmentation, responded with austerity, cutting spending and raising taxes in the middle of a depression. The result was deeper misery and radicalization. This time, there would be no American rescue. The system had exhausted its credibility, and the social anger unleashed by mass unemployment would prove far more dangerous than hyperinflation, because now, millions had nothing left to lose. By 1930, the Weimar Republic was no longer governing in the normal sense. Parliament was paralyzed. Coalition governments collapsed one after another, unable to agree on budgets, unemployment relief, or how to respond to the deepening depression, with millions out of work and state revenues collapsing. The political system seized up. President Paul von Hindenburg, a symbol of Imperial Germany, increasingly ruled by emergency decree under Article 48 of the Constitution. Laws were no longer debated, they were imposed. Democracy was hollowing out from within. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning pursued a policy of strict austerity. He believed that demonstrating fiscal discipline would convince foreign creditors to ease reparations. Instead, his policies deepened the depression. Wages fell, welfare was cut, taxes rose, unemployment reached catastrophic levels, breadlines stretched for blocks. Shantytowns known as Notstandsiedlung appeared on the outskirts of cities. The promise of the Weimar Republic, social progress, stability, dignity, rang increasingly hollow. Extremist parties thrived in this environment. The Communist Party KPD promised revolution and overthrow of capitalism. The National Socialist German Workers' Party NSDAP promised national rebirth, revenge against Versailles, and an end to political paralysis. Both rejected democracy outright. Street violence became routine. Paramilitary groups, communist militias, and Nazi stormtroopers battled openly. Police were overwhelmed or sympathetic. The state's monopoly on violence eroded. Elections turned into referendums on despair. In 1928, the Nazis had won just 2.6% of the vote. By 1930, they surged to 18.3%, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. They did not win power through a coup. They won legitimacy through ballots cast by people who had lost faith in everything else. Conservative elites believed they could control Hitler. They saw him as a useful demagogue, a mass mobilizer who could be harnessed to crush the left. While preserving traditional power structures, they underestimated him catastrophically. In January 1933, under pressure from advisors and political deadlock, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. It was meant to be a compromise. It became a fatal mistake. Within weeks, civil liberties were suspended, opposition parties were crushed, trade unions were destroyed. Germany ceased to be a democracy without a formal abolition of its constitution. The road from Versailles to dictatorship was not inevitable, but it was paved by economic collapse, political paralysis, and the systematic destruction of trust, first in money, then in institutions, and finally in democracy itself. The tragedy of the interwar period was not rooted in a single bad decision, it was the cumulative effect of many decisions. taken by leaders who believed they were acting rationally within the limits of their own fears, debts, and domestic pressures. The Treaty of Versailles was not designed to create peace, it was designed to enforce accountability without reconciliation, and that distinction mattered. France sought security after devastation and invasion. Britain sought balance and financial recovery. The United States sought repayment without responsibility. Germany sought survival under humiliation. Each actor pursued its own interests, and in doing so, constructed a system that could not sustain itself. Reparations were the central fault line. They were politically impossible for Germany to accept, economically impossible to pay, and strategically dangerous for Europe to enforce. Every attempt to extract them weakened the very economy that was supposed to generate the payments. When Germany collapsed, so did the entire structure. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed faith in money. The Depression after 1929 destroyed faith in work. The emergency rule of the early 1930s destroyed faith in democracy. By the time Hitler took power, the moral and institutional defenses of the Republic were already gone. Authoritarianism did not arrive as a sudden shock, it arrived as a solution to problems that democracy appeared incapable of solving. This was the ultimate failure of the post-war order, not that it punished Germany too harshly, but that it punished Germany without stabilizing Europe. The architects of Versailles believed they could impose costs without consequences. History proved them wrong. The lesson is not limited to Germany. The economic systems that prioritize punishment over sustainability breed instability. Financial architectures built on debt without growth collapse under stress. Political legitimacy cannot survive repeated betrayal of expectations. The Second World War did not begin in 1939. It began in 1919, in conference rooms where short-term justice was chosen over long-term peace. And when the bill finally came due, it was paid in blood.